Welcome to Climate Optimists. I'm Jason Lewis. We decided this week to give Todd a break, and so excited to have Thomas Mills, our resident energy expert here from Down Under. Welcome, Thomas.
Thanks, Jason. I'm glad I could help out.
So before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to all those of you who've donated to the podcast. As a new nonprofit, your financial support is the reason we're able to bring the latest on climate solutions each week. We wouldn't be able to do it without you. And if you haven't donated but would like to join our community of supporters, head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and look for the donate button. So based on a number of listener requests, we decided this week to dig into the world of cryptocurrency and its climate impacts. And I'll admit, as somebody who wasn't intimately familiar, the results are pretty shocking. So Thomas, have you joined in on the latest Bitcoin craze?
I sort of missed that bus, Jason, and really on purpose. I right from the early days of cryptocurrency, I saw it a bit like the tulip bulb bubble in the 1600s in Holland. And the longer this craze has gone on, the more it really starts to look like that whole bunch of speculative investment that really doesn't do a lot of good things for the world.
Yeah, like you, it's I'm watching with caution and wondering, when the bubble's going to pop.
Yeah, it's been said by many people that it's worked out great for the drug dealers and those into dodgy things because it makes it easier for them to move money around. But for the average person, I don't think it's going to revolution anyone's life anytime soon.
Agreed. Well, with that, let's pivot to this week's reason for hope. And sounds like you've uncovered a good one.
Yeah, I think for the first time in the US military's history, they've released a climate strategy. And there was a recent Reuters article covering this. Basically, the strategy calls for cutting of emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2050. The development of all-electric non-tactical vehicles by 2035, and basically 100% carbon-free electricity for all army installations by 2030. So definitely a move in the right direction. And
Yeah.
the US military's carbon footprint is massive. As the biggest military force in the world, they emit more emissions than Sweden, Peru, or Hungary. So yeah, hopefully we can not only move them in the right direction, but those will have trickle-down effects for the rest of us.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around how large they are, and the fact that, entire countries don't have the footprint of the US Armed Forces. But excited to see though that they're moving in the right direction. And, many times here in the US when the military makes a move on new technology, it really does help scale things up and bring costs down for the rest of us. Like all of our topics, we did a fair amount of research on cryptocurrency in preparation for today's episode, but as neither one of us are crypto experts, if we miss something, look for you to keep us honest. But let's start out with the basic question, which I'm sure many of you have, which is, what is cryptocurrency exactly? Some have called it gambling for tech billionaires like your Elon Musks and Jack Dorseys. Others have said it's a payment solution for your neighborhood arms dealer or drug lord. And some have proclaimed that, it's really the beginning of the end of cash. Well, in its most basic form, cryptocurrency is just a virtual medium of exchange that only exists digitally. So, the basic differences being there's no coin or bill associated with it. It's not based on an asset like gold. And there's, no central authority like a bank that's involved to monitor transactions. And that really leads into the question of how does it actually work? So without a central authority like a bank and with no physical assets, cryptocurrency relies on a couple of tools to facilitate transactions. The first is what's called a decentralized ledger. And I think of it almost like a community ledger of sorts. So instead of a single ledger that, your credit card company might use to track all your transactions, in the cryptocurrency world, you have a ledger that is shared across the network, and there are many copies of it. The second tool is a technology called blockchain that stores the transactions that make up the digital ledger. A block, in its most basic form, is just a list of transactions and has a unique digital fingerprint. The blocks themselves are linked together by storing the digital fingerprint of their predecessor. So if you had 5 blocks, block 5 has the digital fingerprint of block 4 has the digital fingerprint of block 3, and so on. The linked together blocks are referred to as a chain, thus blockchain. The third tool that cryptocurrency relies on is what's called the mining process, where you have a group of computers, otherwise called miners, that are verifying the transactions that are taking place, compiling those transactions into blocks, and then working to solve a mathematical puzzle in order to have their block accepted as the new block. And their compensation for doing all this is new currency. So in essence, miners track the transactions, compile them into blocks, compete to have their block chosen, and if they win that race, they get new cryptocurrency. So let's try a little example. If you're going to the bike shop to buy a bike and going to use your credit card to make the transaction, the bike shop contacts your bank first to make sure you have the funds available. Once that's confirmed, the funds are transferred between your bank and their bank, and then the ledgers of both banks are updated accordingly. If you're going to use cryptocurrency to buy the bike shop would look to a network of miners or computers to verify that you have the funds available, and then that same network of miners would record the transaction along with a number of other transactions in a block, and then that block is used to update the decentralized ledger that stores all the transactions associated with the currency. Now, to be fair, I'm glossing over a few details, but the reality is, as you get more into the details, it gets more complex and harder to explain. So that's my best attempt at cryptocurrency 101. So with that in mind, it's worth stepping back and looking at the cryptocurrency market as a whole. So as of the end of 2021, there were over 10,000 different cryptocurrencies in circulation, and crypto assets surpassed 3 trillion globally. The largest of the cryptocurrencies in circulation is Bitcoin, which some folks may be familiar with, and the second is Ethereum. Did I miss anything, Thomas? And maybe more importantly, how does this link back to climate change?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well, Jason, and probably not an easy thing to sum up. I think the reason we're here is to look into the emissions associated with the transacting of cryptocurrencies, and it's really not a good place to to look.
Yeah. So for folks who may be wondering in the lead up here, I mean, what is the problem, right? Why is cryptocurrency, getting attention in, newspapers and periodicals, and getting, blamed for having a big carbon footprint?
It's driven primarily by the fact that each transaction uses a massive amount of energy compared to transacting with typical fiat currencies, be them in an electronic format, Visa, MasterCard, or what have you, or cash and the creation of cash and its utilization in society, which is rapidly diminishing, especially during these pandemic times. But Bitcoin's energy consumption right now stands at greater than the energy consumption of all the servers of Google, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft. And the consumption of Bitcoin and Ethereum, the second biggest cryptocurrency, is almost the same as the electricity consumption of the entire UK. So not insignificant. And the thing that really drives this is this proof of work validation for each transaction. And basically, what you have is a whole bunch of computers pegged against each other, competing for validation of the blockchain. And as the value of the currency grows, so too does the energy intensity as these miners are competing once against one another to validate the blockchain. I guess you can look at it like a bit of a digital gold rush. So what are your thoughts, Jason?
Yeah, similarly, in kind of doing our homework for this, it's clear that the root of the problem is really the energy intensity of a given transaction. We know our electrical grid isn't cleaner in certain parts of the world, but given that it sucks up so much energy, it in turn has a large, carbon footprint. And one of the reasons why China recently banned what they call, Bitcoin mining, because of the, carbon emissions it was generating. And those miners, as they call them, are now dispersing elsewhere across the world looking for cheap electricity. But I think the fact that a nation like China basically said, no more, Bitcoin mining, speaks volumes to the problem. While we're talking about cryptocurrencies, I think it's also worth calling out two related problems. The first is a technology called non fungible tokens, or NFTs. NFTs are a growing trend in the art world and serve as a sort of digital certificate of ownership for virtual or physical assets. They can be bought and sold and are marketed as a tool to stop the duplication of digital art. The problem with NFTs is they're stored in blockchain and secured using the same energy intensive validation process of cryptocurrencies. So, like cryptocurrencies, they have a massive carbon footprint. On average, an NFT generates 440 pounds of carbon, or equivalent to driving 500 miles in a gas powered car. The second issue is a problem of e waste. Crypto miners, to be successful, want the latest technology, and the hardware they rely on becomes obsolete quickly. This all leads to between 8 and 12,000 tons of e waste that's generated annually. So I guess bottom line, the process is energy intensive. You have this other technology, related technology called these non-fungible tokens taking off. And, that process as well is energy intensive. And then, on top of it all, you've got the e-waste problem. So some might be asking, well, how does this compare to our currency transactions that we have today, right? How does a Bitcoin compare to, a credit card transaction? And while the numbers aren't static, the reality is, as of this week, one Bitcoin transaction consumed the energy equivalent to 2.3 million, that's million, Visa transactions. And, as of this last year, the average transaction size for Bitcoin was, $16,000, and Visa, only 50. But that disparity aside, the fact is it's hugely inefficient, when we compare it to existing forms of digital financial transactions. So, all this leads to, I guess, the question of, are there solutions out there, right? And, for those listeners who might be advocates of cryptocurrency, trying to figure out, how do I do this in a more ecologically friendly way? Well, there are a number of sort of solutions that are on the table, and we thought we'd kind of talk about each one separately. So one school of thought is, as these cryptocurrency miners, as they're called, are looking for sources of energy, there's been a push by some to try to use oil and gas flaring to help power the cryptocurrency mining process. In other words, you would locate the facilities on site with oil and gas, and be able to capture that natural gas that was otherwise being flared into the atmosphere. And so those who are proponents of the solution look at it as a way to solve all the methane emissions associated with gas flaring. And on the surface, that can look promising. I think the challenge when you talk to experts is that anytime you have a project historically that is designed to capture flared or vented gas, has the problem eventually of creating increased demand for gas production, which is obviously the opposite of what we want to be having. So as one expert put it, it's like if you have a leaky gasoline pipeline, and instead of fixing the problem, you plugged in a Humvee next to the leak and left the engine running perpetually with the AC on full blast. So, not ideal. One of the other solutions I know that's been floated is, focusing on, like with many technologies and businesses, moving cryptocurrency over to, to renewable energy sources like solar and wind. And Thomas, I know, you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, so Jack Dorsey, who is the founder of the Square payment platform, is a big believer in driving all of this to net zero by 2030. And he, of course, sees renewable energy as a key part of that equation. But the problem is that we need to deploy as much renewable energy as possible to replace the existing energy requirements of our societies, which is sourced in many places predominantly with the use of fossil fuels. So really, we need to be focusing on having all systems operate more efficiently, not taking something like the financial systems that we have today and shifting ourselves towards a system that, on a per dollar basis, is almost 2,000 times less efficient per unit of transacted currency. So it seems a bit counterproductive, really. Great, let's talk about renewable energy, but let's not go and bring systems into play that are less efficient than what we have today.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the reality is, I think in discussions about climate solutions, oftentimes people get focused on, myself included, on, hey, it's all about getting off of the fossil fuels. But the reality is, we have such a huge transition that we need to make in front of us. The other like unsung hero often is energy efficiency, right? Like if we consume less, we reduce the problem today. And so, yeah, to your point, I mean, having a technology that is way less efficient than the one we have for financial transactions seems just like a step in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I feel that sometimes the whole cryptocurrency situation is a solution looking for a problem. I think we have a financial system there already that works. I think there was a big pivot towards cryptocurrencies as a lot of governments essentially printed money or did fiscal easing during these pandemic times to try and keep their economies afloat and stop them imploding. And that pushed up inflation and it made people sort of panic and run to asset classes that they maybe wouldn't normally. And I think that created this boom or this bubble that we see today. But if we think that we're going to make this mainstream, then it's really not going to be in the form that it is today. There needs to be some massive changes if cryptocurrency and this distributed ledger type environment is going to take hold in the future.
Yeah, that's a great point. I and leads to one of the other potential solutions, and I think, from my perspective, the most viable, which is, how do you take, cryptocurrency in its current state and make it more energy efficient? And experts talking a lot about this change to the validation model. We've been talking about this thing called proof of work, that, without getting mired in the details, is just very energy intensive, and moving to a different model for validation called proof of stake. I think, without getting into the specifics, the takeaway for me is just, it requires a fraction of the energy. Ethereum, that we mentioned earlier, that is really the number two cryptocurrency out there, is in the process of moving to a proof of stake model, and they claim, this all needs to pan out, but it would cut their emissions by 99.95%. So a huge change in the positive direction. It's unclear exactly when they're going to make this transition, but they say they're planning to do it, in 2022. And then, Cardano, another, big cryptocurrency, was built on proof of stake validation from day one. So is already orders of magnitude more efficient than, say, Bitcoin. So, we'll still need to see how this all pans out, but I think there's a recognition, within, the cryptocurrency space, that the energy intensity has to be reduced for cryptocurrency to, continue to survive as something viable.
But even with those efficiency improvements, it still only brings it just within the realm of what we have today with central ledgers. There's no step change in efficiency from where we are today to something better. So, and I think what you'll also find too, that the central governments and banking systems are going to fight this tooth and nail. They're not going to go down without a good hard crack at stopping it from happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this takes control out of their hands, and, adds, you know, potentially a lot more volatility, which is obviously not what somebody in the finance space thinks of as a good thing. Um, I know the EU has already called, for a ban on the proof of work validation that we've mentioned, and, you know, there's signs in the US as well that regulation is stepping up. there's an awareness of the problem. And I know Elizabeth Warren in the Senate was holding hearings focused on the energy intensity or energy consumption rather of some of these big mining operations. So I don't think it's a secret at this point. And if these cryptocurrencies don't sort of voluntarily find ways to become more efficient, I think they're going to be looking at force to become so. So, Thomas, I think this really leads back to what you mentioned earlier, which is it feels to some degree like, cryptocurrency is really a solution in need of a problem. And while I'm not going to in any way pretend to know all the nuances, the philosophical reasons that cryptocurrency provides value, when we're looking at it from an energy perspective, which is, what we do here, it it's clear that we have something that's already much more efficient. And until the day when, a cryptocurrency can, be substantially more efficient, on a per transaction basis than what we have today, it seems like it's really sort of a redundant system that we don't need.
Yeah. And what I'd like to add is like, I'd hate to be the last person on that bus because if central authorities, which we're all part of, as we choose to be part of a society, decide that it's not the right thing, the rules can change really quickly, and value can disappear out of those things faster than the blink of an eye.
Very true. I think the other thing to call out is the fact that there's, even some change in thinking occurring within industry. So, while there are businesses today that are trying to figure out, how to get into cryptocurrency and dealing in those sort of transactions, you have somebody like Tesla that decided to move away from Bitcoin, and while they do accept Dogecoin, another cryptocurrency, for some transactions, the reality is by moving away from Bitcoin, they've shined a light on this problem. And you know, I think other organizations, PayPal, and in Squarespace that we talked about earlier, there is going to have to be a long and hard look as these companies, that are billing themselves as environmentally progressive are dealing in this digital currency that is hugely energy consumptive. So I guess all that is to say that I think these companies starting to Tesla starting to lean in and others could drive some massive change in the right direction all on its own.
Yeah, because we've got to make this thing a bit more upbeat because we've kind of just shat on the whole thing thus far.
Yeah, that's fair. So I guess to recap, we've covered a lot of ground here really quickly, and I'm sure in some ways we've created more questions than than answers. But the reality is, I mean, the takeaways, at least for me, are that we have this digital currency technology that is orders of magnitude less efficient than what we already have today. And if it's going to be something that's viable in light of being able to solve climate change, that energy intensity is going to have to fall dramatically. And while, wind and solar are growing exponentially around the world, we need to be looking at ways to cut our energy consumption, not increase it. And I think in the case of cryptocurrencies, I really hope to see the proof of stake model work out and to see a massive reduction in the energy intensity. But at the end of the day, unless it's creating benefit above and beyond what we already have in terms of a currency system, I just can't wrap my head around the value.
Yeah, I think from a climate perspective, don't be sad if you've missed the crypto boat because up until now and up until these proof of stake models become commonplace, it's been nothing short of an environmental disaster. I think until they get all of that sorted, in the meantime, I'm going to be heading down to the store and buying myself some tulip bulbs because I hear they're going cheap at the moment.
Let me know how that works out.
I will, Jason.
So I think that all leads to what can we do, and I think the biggest thing, at least from my perspective, is help spread awareness about this. The more that people understand about the environmental impact of cryptocurrency, the more that acts as a forcing function to help drive change. And if you are going to purchase cryptocurrency, you want to go, play in that space, make sure that you're selecting a cryptocurrency that has low energy intensity, uses that proof of stake model to ensure that, in the process, we're not making the problem solving climate change, harder than it already is. So if you're looking to expand your cryptocurrency knowledge base, there were a number of great pieces we relied on for today's episode. One from Columbia University, another from University of Colorado. We've got links to those in our show notes, so head over to our website and check them out. So I think, Thomas, that's a wrap for this week. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co, and don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.